Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today I'll be reading another work of Arthur Schopenhauer's. This one is titled Human Nature. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our channel members Joshua Anolik, Torritz, Catherine McMillan, Dink Smallwood, and Ronnie Limestone. If you are interested in joining the channel, you can find more information linked in the description below. Thanks for listening. Truths of the physical order may possess much external significance, but internal significance they have none. The latter is the privilege of intellectual and moral truths, which are concerned with the objectification of the will in its highest stages, whereas physical truths are concerned with it in its lowest. For example, if we could establish the truth of what up till now is only a conjecture, namely, that it is the action of the sun which produces thermoelectricity at the equator, that this produces terrestrial magnetism, and that this magnetism again is the cause of the aurora borealis, these would be truths of externally great, but internally of little significance. On the other hand, examples of internal significance are furnished by all great and true philosophical systems, by the catastrophe of every good tragedy, nay, even by the observation of human conduct in the extreme manifestations of its morality and immorality, of its good and its evil character. For all these are expressions of that reality which takes outward shape as the world, and which, in the highest stages of its objectivation, proclaims its innermost nature. To say that the world has only a physical and not a moral significance is the greatest and most pernicious of all errors, the fundamental blunder, the real perversity of mind and temper, and, at bottom, it is doubtless the tendency which faith personifies as Antichrist. Nevertheless, in spite of all religions, and they are systems which one and all maintain the opposite, and seek to establish it in their mythical way, this fundamental error never becomes quite extinct, but raises its head from time to time afresh, until universal indignation compels it to hide itself once more. Yet, however certain we may feel of the moral significance of life and the world, to explain and illustrate it, and to resolve the contradiction between this significance and the world as it is, form a task of great difficulty, so great, indeed, as to make it possible that it has remained for me to exhibit the true and only genuine sound basis of morality everywhere and at all times effective, together with the result to which it leads. The actual facts of morality are too much on my side for me to fear that my theory can ever be replaced or upset by any other. However, so long as even my ethical system continues to be ignored by the professional world, it is Kant's moral principle that prevails in the universities. Among its various forms, the one which is most in favor at present is the dignity of man. I have already exposed the absurdity of this doctrine in my treatise on the foundation of morality. Therefore, I will only say here that if the question were asked on what the alleged dignity of man rests, it would not be long before the answer was made that it rests upon his morality. In other words, his morality rests upon his dignity, and his dignity rests upon his morality. But apart from this circular argument, it seems to me that the idea of dignity can be applied only in an ironical sense to a being whose will is so sinful, whose intellect is so limited, whose body is so weak and perishable as man's. How shall a man be proud when his conception is a crime, his birth a penalty, his life a labor, and death a necessity? Therefore, in opposition to the above-mentioned form of the Kantian principle, I should be inclined to lay down the following rule. When you come into contact with a man, no matter whom, do not attempt an objective appreciation of him according to his worth and dignity. Do not consider his bad will, or his narrow understanding and perverse ideas, as the former may easily lead you to hate, and the latter to despise him. But fix your attention only upon his sufferings, his needs, his anxieties, and his pains. Then you will always feel your kinship with him. You will sympathize with him, and instead of hatred or contempt, you will experience the commiseration that alone is the peace to which the gospel calls us. The way to keep down hatred and contempt is certainly not to look for a man's alleged dignity, but on the contrary, to regard him as an object of pity. The Buddhists, as the result of the more profound views which they entertain on ethical and metaphysical subjects, start from the cardinal vices and not the cardinal virtues, since the virtues make their appearance only as the contraries or negations of the vices. According to Schmidt's History of the Eastern Mongolians, the cardinal vices in the Buddhist scheme are 4: lust, indolence, anger, and avarice. But probably instead of indolence we should read pride, for so it stands in the Letters Edificants et Curieux, where envy or hatred is added as a 5th. I am confirmed in correcting the statement of the excellent Schmidt by the fact that my rendering agrees with the doctrine of the Sufis, who are certainly under the influence of the Brahmins and the Buddhists. The Sufis also maintain that there are 4 cardinal vices, and they arrange them in very striking pairs, so that lust appears in connection with avarice and anger with pride. The 4 cardinal virtues opposed to them would be chastity and generosity, together with gentleness and humility. When we compare these profound ideas of morality, as they are entertained by Oriental nations, with the celebrated cardinal virtues of Plato, which have been recapitulated again and again, justice, valor, temperance, and wisdom, it is plain that the latter are not based on any clear, leading idea, but are chosen on grounds that are superficial, and, in part, obviously false. Virtues must be qualities of the will, but wisdom is chiefly an attribute of the intellect, Greek sophrosyne, which Cicero translates temperantia, is a very indefinite and ambiguous word, and it admits, therefore, of a variety of applications. It may mean discretion, or abstinence, or keeping a level head. Courage is not a virtue at all, although sometimes it is a servant or instrument of virtue, but it is just as ready to become the servant of the greatest villainy. It is really a quality of temperament. Even Gelinx, in the preface to his Ethics, condemned the Platonic virtues and put the following in their place: diligence, obedience, justice, and humility, which are obviously bad. The Chinese distinguish 5 cardinal virtues: sympathy, justice, propriety, wisdom, and sincerity. The virtues of Christianity are theological, not cardinal: faith, love, and hope. Fundamental disposition towards others, assuming the character either of envy or of sympathy, is the point at which the moral virtues and the vices of mankind first diverge. These 2 diametrically opposed qualities exist in every man, for they spring from the inevitable comparison which he draws between his own lot and that of others. According as the result of this comparison affects his individual character, does the one or the other of these qualities become the source and principle of all his action. Envy builds the wall between thee and me thicker and stronger. Sympathy makes it slight and transparent. Nay, sometimes it pulls down the wall altogether, and then the distinction between self and not self vanishes. Valor, which has been mentioned as a virtue, or rather the courage on which it is based, for valor is only courage in war, deserves a closer examination. The ancients reckoned courage among the virtues, and cowardice among the vices, but there is no corresponding idea in the Christian scheme, which makes for charity and patience, and in its teaching forbids all enmity or even resistance. The result is that with the moderns, courage is no longer a virtue. Nevertheless, it must be admitted that cowardice does not seem to be very compatible with any nobility of character, if only for the reason that it betrays an overgreat apprehension about one's own person. Courage, however, may also be explained as a readiness to meet ills that threaten at the moment, in order to avoid greater ills that lie in the future, whereas cowardice does the contrary. But this readiness is of the same quality as patience, for patience consists in the clear consciousness that greater evils than those which are present, and that any violent attempt to flee from or guard against the ills we may have, bring the others upon us. Courage, then, would be a kind of patience, and since it is patience that enables us to practice forbearance and self-control, courage is, through the medium of patience, at least akin to virtue. But perhaps courage admits of being considered from a higher point of view. The fear of death may, in every case, be traced to a deficiency in that natural philosophy, natural and therefore resting on mere feeling, which gives a man the assurance that he exists in everything outside him, just as much as in his own person, so that the death of his person can do him little harm. But it is just this very assurance that would give a man heroic courage, and therefore, as the reader will recollect from my Ethics, courage comes from the same source as the virtues of justice and humanity. This is, I admit, to take a very high view of the matter, but apart from it I cannot well explain why cowardice seems contemptible, and personal courage a noble and sublime thing. For no lower point of view enables me to see why a finite individual, who is everything to himself, nay, who is himself even the very fundamental condition of the existence of the rest of the world, should not put his own preservation above every other aim. It is, then, an insufficient explanation of courage to make it rest only on utility, to give it an empirical and not a transcendental character. It may have been for some such reason that Calderon once uttered a skeptical but remarkable opinion in regard to courage, nay, actually denied its reality, and put his denial into the mouth of a wise old minister, addressing his young sovereign. Although, he observed, natural fear is operative in all alike, a man may be brave in not letting it be seen, and it is this that constitutes courage. In regard to the difference which I have mentioned between the ancients and the moderns in their estimate of courage as a virtue, it must be remembered that by virtue, virtus, or Greek arete, the ancients understood every excellence or quality that was praiseworthy in itself. It might be moral or intellectual or possibly only physical. But when Christianity demonstrated that the fundamental tendency of life was moral, it was moral superiority alone that henceforth attached to the notion of virtue. Meanwhile, the earlier usage still survived in the elder Latinists and also in Italian writers, as is proved by the well-known meaning of the word virtuoso. The special attention of students should be drawn to this wider range of the idea of virtue amongst the ancients, as otherwise it might easily be a source of secret perplexity. I may recommend 2 passages preserved for us by Stobaeus, which will serve for this purpose. One of them is apparently from the Pythagorean philosopher Metopus, in which the fitness of every bodily member is declared to be a virtue. The other pronounces that the virtue of a shoemaker is to make good shoes. This may also serve to explain why it is that in the ancient scheme of ethics, virtues and vices are mentioned which find no place in ours. As the place of courage amongst the virtues is a matter of doubt, so is that of avarice amongst the vices. It must not, however, be confounded with greed, which is the most immediate meaning of the Latin word avaritia. Let us then draw up and examine the arguments pro et contra in regard to avarice, and leave the final judgment to be formed by every man for himself. On the one hand, it is argued that it is not avarice which is a vice, but extravagance, its opposite. Extravagance springs from a brutish limitation to the present moment, in comparison with which the future, existing as it does only in thought, is as nothing. It rests upon the illusion that sensual pleasures possess a positive or a real value. Accordingly, future need and misery is the price at which the spendthrift purchases pleasures that are empty, fleeting, and often no more than imaginary, or else feeds his vain, stupid self-conceit on the bows and scrapes of parasites who laugh at him in secret, or on the gaze of the mob and those who envy his magnificence. We should, therefore, shun the spendthrift as though he had the plague, and on discovering his vice break him betimes, in order that later on, when the consequences of his extravagance ensue, we may neither have to help him bear them, nor, on the other hand, have to play the part of the friends of Timon of Athens. At the same time, it is not to be expected that he who foolishly squanders his own fortune will leave another man's intact, if it should chance to be committed to his keeping. Nay, Sui profusus and alieni appetens are by Sallust very rightly conjoined. Hence it is that extravagance leads not only to impoverishment, but also to crime, and crime amongst the moneyed classes is almost always the result of extravagance. It is accordingly with justice that the Koran declares all spendthrifts to be brothers of Satan. But it is superfluity that avarice brings in its train, and when was that superfluity ever unwelcome? That must be a good vice which has good consequences. Avarice proceeds upon the principle that all pleasure is only negative in its operation, and that the happiness which consists of a series of pleasures is a chimera. That, on the contrary, it is pains which are positive and extremely real. Accordingly, the avaricious man foregoes the former, in order that he may be the better preserved from the latter, and thus it is that bear and forbear, sustine ad abstine, is his maxim. And because he knows, further, how inexhaustible are the possibilities of misfortune, and how innumerable the paths of danger, he increases the means of avoiding them, in order, if possible, to surround himself with a triple wall of protection. Who, then, can say where precaution against disaster begins to be exaggerated? He alone who knows where the malignity of fate reaches its limits. And even if precaution were exaggerated, it is an error which at the most would hurt the man who took it, and not others. If he will never need the treasures which he lays up for himself, they will one day benefit others whom nature has made less careful. That until then he withdraws the money from circulation is no misfortune, for money is not an article of consumption. It only represents the good things which a man may actually possess, and is not one itself. Coins are only counters. Their value is what they represent, and what they represent cannot be withdrawn from circulation. Moreover, by holding back the money, the value of the remainder which is in circulation is enhanced by precisely the same amount. Even though it be the case, as is said, that many a miser comes in the end to love money itself for its own sake, it is equally certain that many a spendthrift, on the other hand, loves spending and squandering for no better reason. Friendship with a miser is not only without danger, but it is profitable, because of the great advantages it can bring. For it is doubtless those who are nearest and dearest to the miser, who on his death will reap the fruits of the self-control which he exercised, but even in his lifetime too, something may be expected of him in cases of great need. At any rate, one can always hope for more from him than from the spendthrift, who has lost his all and is himself helpless and in debt. Más de el duro que el desnudo, says a Spanish proverb. The man who has a hard heart will give more than the man who has an empty purse. The upshot of all this is that avarice is not a vice. On the other side, it may be said that avarice is the quintessence of all vices. When physical pleasures seduce a man from the right path, it is his sensual nature, the animal part of him, which is at fault. He is carried away by its attractions, and, overcome by the impression of the moment, he acts without thinking of the consequences. When, on the other hand, he is brought by age or bodily weakness to the condition in which the vices that he could never abandon end by abandoning him, and his capacity for physical pleasure dies, if he turns to avarice, the intellectual desire survives the sensual. Money, which represents all the good things of this world, and is these good things in the abstract, now becomes the dry trunk overgrown with all the dead lusts of the flesh, which are egoism in the abstract. They come to life again in the love of mammon. The transient pleasure of the senses has become a deliberate and calculated lust of money, which, like that to which it is directed, is symbolical in its nature, and like it, indestructible. This obstinate love of the pleasures of the world, a love which, as it were, outlives itself, this utterly incorrigible sin, this refined and sublimated desire of the flesh, is the abstract form in which all lusts are concentrated, and to which it stands like a general idea to individual particulars. Accordingly, avarice is the vice of age, just as extravagance is the vice of youth. This disputatio in utramque partem, this debate for and against, is certainly calculated to drive us into accepting the just milieu morality of Aristotle, a conclusion that is also supported by the following consideration. Every human perfection is allied to a defect into which it threatens to pass, but it is also true that every defect is allied to a perfection. Hence it is that if, as often happens, we make a mistake about a man, it is because at the beginning of our acquaintance with him we confound his defects with the kind of perfection to which they are allied. The cautious man seems to us a coward, the economical man a miser, the spendthrift seems liberal, the rude fellow downright and sincere, and the foolhardy person looks as if he were going to work with a noble self-confidence, and so on in many other cases. No one can live among men without feeling drawn again and again to the tempting supposition that moral baseness and intellectual incapacity are closely connected, as though they both sprang direct from one source. That, however, is not so, I have shown in detail. That it seems to be so is merely due to the fact that both are so often found together, and the circumstance is to be explained by the very frequent occurrence of each of them, so that it may easily happen for both to be compelled to live under one roof. At the same time, it is not to be denied that they play into each other's hands to their mutual benefit, and it is this that produces the very unedifying spectacle which only too many men exhibit, and that makes the world to go as it goes. A man who is unintelligent is very likely to show his perfidy, villainy, and malice, whereas a clever man understands how to conceal these qualities. And how often, on the other hand, does a perversity of heart prevent a man from seeing truths which his intelligence is quite capable of grasping? Nevertheless, let no one boast. Just as every man, though he be the greatest genius, has very definite limitations in some one sphere of knowledge, and thus attests his common origin with the essentially perverse and stupid mass of mankind, so also has every man something in his nature which is positively evil. Even the best, nay, the noblest character, will sometimes surprise us by isolated traits of depravity, as though it were to acknowledge his kinship with the human race, in which villainy, nay, cruelty, is to be found in that degree. For it was just in virtue of this evil in him, this bad principle, that of necessity he became a man, and, for the same reason, the world in general is what my clear mirror of it has shown it to be. But in spite of all this, the difference even between one man and another is incalculably great, and many a one would be horrified to see another as he really is. Oh, for some Asmodeus of morality, to make not only roofs and walls transparent to his favorites, but also to lift the veil of dissimulation, fraud, hypocrisy, pretense, falsehood, and deception, which is spread over all things, to show how little true honesty there is in the world, and how often, even where it is least to be expected, behind all the exterior outwork of virtue, secretly and in the innermost recesses, unrighteousness sits at the helm. It is just on this account that so many men of the better kind have four-footed friends. For, to be sure, how is a man to get relief from the endless dissimulation, falsity, and malice of mankind, if there were no dogs into whose honest faces he can look without distrust? For what is our civilized world but a big masquerade, where you meet knights, priests, soldiers, men of learning, barristers, clergymen, philosophers, and I don't know what all. But they are not what they pretend to be. They are only masks, and, as a rule, behind the masks you will find money-makers. One man, I suppose, puts on the mask of law, which he has borrowed for the purpose from a barrister, only in order to be able to give another man a sound drubbing. A second has chosen the mask of patriotism and the public welfare with a similar intent. A third takes religion or purity of doctrine. For all sorts of purposes men have often put on the mask of philosophy, and even of philanthropy, and I know not what besides. Women have a smaller choice. As a rule, they avail themselves of the mask of morality, modesty, domesticity, and humility. Then there are general masks, without any particular character attaching to them like dominoes. They may be met with everywhere, and of this sort is the strict rectitude, the courtesy, the sincere sympathy, the smiling friendship that people profess. The whole of these masks, as a rule, are merely, as I have said, a disguise for some industry, commerce, or speculation. It is merchants alone who, in this respect, constitute any honest class. They are the only people who give themselves out to be what they are, and therefore they go about without any mask at all, and consequently take a humble rank. It is very necessary that a man should be appraised early in life, that it is a masquerade in which he finds himself, for otherwise there are many things which he will fail to understand and put up with, nay, at which he will be completely puzzled, and that man longest of all, whose heart is made of better clay, et meliori luto, finsict praecordia titan. Such, for instance, is the favor that villainy finds, the neglect that merit, even the rarest and the greatest, suffers at the hands of those of the same profession, the hatred of truth and great capacity, the ignorance of scholars in their own province, and the fact that true wares are almost always despised, and the merely specious ones in request. Therefore, let even the young be instructed betimes that in this masquerade the apples are of wax, the flowers of silk, the fish of pasteboard, and that all things, yes, all things, are toys and trifles, and that of two men whom he may see earnestly engaged in business, one is supplying spurious goods, and the other is paying for them in false coin. But there are more serious reflections to be made, and worse things to be recorded. Man is at bottom a savage, horrible beast. We know it, if only in the business of taming and restraining him which we call civilization. Hence it is that we are terrified if now and then his nature breaks out. Wherever and whenever the locks and chains of law and order fall off and give place to anarchy, he shows himself for what he really is. But it is unnecessary to wait for anarchy in order to gain enlightenment on this subject. 100 records, old and new, produce the conviction that in his unrelenting cruelty, man is in no way inferior to the tiger and the hyena. A forcible example is supplied by a publication of the year 1841 entitled Slavery and the Internal Slave Trade in the United States of North America, being replies to questions transmitted by the British Anti-Slavery Society to the American Anti-Slavery Society. This book constitutes one of the heaviest indictments against the human race. No one can put it down without a feeling of horror, and few without tears. For, whatever the reader may have heard, or imagined, or dreamt of the unhappy condition of slavery, or indeed of human cruelty in general, it will seem small to him when he reads of the way in which those devils in human form, those bigoted, church-going, strictly Sabbatarian rascals, and in particular the Anglican priests among them, treated their innocent black brothers, who by wrong and violence had got into their diabolical clutches. Other examples are furnished by Tsuri's Travels in Peru, in the description which he gives of the treatment of the Peruvian soldiers at the hands of their officers, and by MacLeod's Travels in Eastern Africa, where the author tells of the cold-blooded and truly devilish cruelty with which the Portuguese in Mozambique treat their slaves. But we need not go for examples to the New World, that obverse side of our planet. In the year 1848 it was brought to life that in England, not in one, but apparently in 100 cases within a brief period, a husband had poisoned his wife, or vice versa, or both had joined in poisoning their children, or in torturing them slowly to death, by starving and ill-treating them, with no other object than to get the money for burying them, which they had insured in the burial clubs against their death. For this purpose a child was often insured in several, even in as many as 20 clubs at once. Details of this character belong, indeed, to the blackest pages in the criminal records of humanity. But, when all is said, it is the inward and innate character of man, this god par excellence of the pantheists, from which they, and everything like them, proceed. In every man there dwells, first and foremost, a colossal egoism, which breaks the bounds of right and justice with the greatest freedom, as everyday life shows on a small scale, and as history on every page of it on a large. Does not the recognized need of a balance of power in Europe, with the anxious way in which it is preserved, demonstrate that man is a beast of prey, who no sooner sees a weaker man near him than he falls upon him without fail? And does not the same hold good of the affairs of ordinary life? But to the boundless egoism of our nature there is joined more or less in every human breast a fund of hatred, anger, envy, rancor, and malice, accumulated like the venom in a serpent's tooth, and waiting only for an opportunity of venting itself, and then, like a demon unchained, of storming and raging. If a man has no great occasion for breaking out, he will end by taking advantage of the smallest, and by working it up into something great by the aid of his imagination. For, however small it may be, it is enough to rouse his anger. And then he will carry it as far as he can and may. We see this in daily life, where such outbursts are well known under the name of venting one's gall on something. It will also have been observed that if such outbursts meet with no opposition, the subject of them feels decidedly the better for them afterwards. That anger is not without its pleasure is a truth that was recorded even by Aristotle, and he quotes a passage from Homer, who declares anger to be sweeter than honey. But not in anger alone, in hatred too, which stands to anger like a chronic to an acute disease, a man may indulge with the greatest delight. Quote, "Now hatred is by far the longest pleasure. Men love in haste, but they detest at leisure." Gobineau, in his work, The Races of Humanity, has called man l'animal méchant par excellence. People take this very ill, because they feel that it hits them, but he is quite right. For man is the only animal which causes pain to others without any further purpose than just to cause it. Other animals never do it except to satisfy their hunger or in the rage of combat. No animal ever torments another for the mere purpose of tormenting, but man does it. And it is this that constitutes the diabolical feature in his character, which is so much worse than the merely animal. I have already spoken of the matter in its broad aspect, but it is manifest even in small things, and every reader has a daily opportunity of observing it. For instance, if two little dogs are playing together, and what a genial and charming sight it is, and a child of 3 or 4 years joins them, it is almost inevitable for it to begin hitting them with a whip or stick, and show itself, even at that age, l'animal méchant par excellence. The love of teasing and playing tricks, which is common enough, may be traced to the same source. For instance, if a man has expressed his annoyance at any interruption or other petty inconvenience, there will be no lack of people who for that very reason will bring it about. Animal méchant par excellence. This is so certain that a man should be careful not to express any annoyance at small evils. On the other hand, he should also be careful not to express his pleasure at any trifle, for if he does so, men will act like the jailer, who, when he found that his prisoner had performed the laborious task of taming a spider, and took pleasure in watching it, immediately crushed it under his foot. This is why all animals are instinctively afraid of the sight or even of the track of a man. Nor does their instinct them false, for it is man alone who hunts game for which he has no use and which does him no harm. It is a fact, then, that in the heart of every man there lies a wild beast, which only waits for an opportunity to storm and rage in its desire to inflict pain on others, or, if they stand in his way, to kill them. It is this which is the source of all the lust of war and battle. In trying to tame, and to some extent hold it in check, the intelligence its appointed keeper has always enough to do. people may, if they please, call it the radical evil of human nature, a name which will at least serve those with whom a word stands for an explanation. I say, however, that it is the will to live, which, more and more embittered by the constant suffering of existence, seeks to alleviate its own torment by causing torment in others. But in this way a man gradually develops in himself real cruelty and malice. The observation may also be added that, as according to Kant, matter subsists only through the antagonism of the powers of expansion and contraction, so human society subsists only by the antagonism of hatred, or anger and fear. For there is a moment in the life of all of us when the malignity of our nature might perhaps make us murderers, if it were not accompanied by a due admixture of fear to keep it within bounds. And this fear again would make a man the sport and laughing-stock of every boy, if anger were not lying ready in him and keeping watch. But it is schadenfreude, a mischievous delight in the misfortunes of others, which remains the worst trait in human nature. It is a feeling which is closely akin to cruelty, and differs from it, to say the truth, only as theory from practice. In general, it may be said of it that it takes the place which pity ought to take, pity, which is its opposite, and the true source of all real justice and charity. Envy is also opposed to pity, but in another sense. Envy, that is to say, is produced by a cause directly antagonistic to that which produces the delight in mischief. The opposition between pity and envy on the one hand, and pity and the delight in mischief on the other, rests in the main on the occasions which call them forth. In the case of envy, it is only as a direct effect of the cause which excites it that we feel it at all. That is just the reason why envy, although it is a reprehensible feeling, still admits of some excuse, and is, in general, a very human quality, whereas the delight in mischief is diabolical, and its taunts are the laughter of hell. The delight in mischief, as I have said, takes the place which pity ought to take. Envy, on the contrary, finds a place only where there is no inducement to pity, or rather an inducement to its opposite, and it is just as this opposite that envy arises in the human breast, and so far, therefore, it may still be reckoned a human sentiment. Nay, I am afraid that no one will be found to be entirely free from it, for that a man should feel his own lack of things more bitterly at the sight of another's delight in the enjoyment of them is natural, nay, it is inevitable. But this should not rouse his hatred of the man who is happier than himself. It is just this hatred, however, in which every true envy consists. Least of all should a man be envious, when it is a question not of the gifts of fortune or chance, or another's favor, but of the gifts of nature. Because everything that is innate in a man rests on a metaphysical basis, and possesses justification of a higher kind. It is, so to speak, given him by divine grace. But, unhappily, it is just in the case of personal advantages that envy is the most irreconcilable. Thus it is that intelligence, or even genius, cannot get on in the world without begging pardon for its existence, wherever it is not in a position to be able, proudly and boldly, to despise the world. In other words, if envy is aroused only by wealth, rank, or power, it is often kept down by egoism, which perceives that, on occasion, assistance, enjoyment, support, protection, advancement, and so on, may be hoped for from the object of envy, or that at least by intercourse with him a man may himself win honor from the reflected light of his superiority. And here, too, there is the hope of one day attaining all those advantages himself. On the other hand, in the envy that is directed to natural gifts and personal advantages, like beauty in women or intelligence in men, there is no consolation or hope of one kind or the other, so that nothing remains but to indulge a bitter and irreconcilable hatred of the person who possesses these privileges, and hence the only remaining desire is to take vengeance on him. But here the envious man finds himself in an unfortunate position, for all his blows fall powerless as soon as it is known that they come from him. Accordingly, he hides his feelings as carefully as if they were secret sins, and so becomes an inexhaustible inventor of tricks and artifices and devices for concealing and masking his procedure, in order that, unperceived, he may wound the object of his envy. For instance, with an air of the utmost unconcern, he will ignore the advantages which are eating his heart out. He will neither see them, nor know them, nor have observed or even heard of them, and thus make himself a master in the art of dissimulation. With great cunning, he will completely overlook the man whose brilliant qualities are gnawing at his heart, and act as though he were quite an unimportant person. He will take no notice of him, and on occasion will have even quite forgotten his existence. But at the same time he will, before all things, endeavor, by secret machination, carefully to deprive those advantages of any opportunity of showing themselves and becoming known. Then, out of his dark corner, he will attack these qualities with censure, mockery, ridicule, and calumny, like the toad which spurts its poison from a hole. No less will he enthusiastically praise unimportant people, or even indifferent or bad performances in the same sphere. In short, he will become a Proteus in stratagem, in order to wound others without showing himself. But what is the use of it? The trained eye recognizes him in spite of it all. He betrays himself, if by nothing else, by the way in which he timidly avoids and flies from the object of his envy, who stands the more completely alone, the more brilliant he is. And this is the reason why pretty girls have no friends of their own sex. He betrays himself, too, by the causeless hatred which he shows, a hatred which finds vent in a violent explosion at any circumstance, however trivial, though it is often only the product of his imagination. How many such men there are in the world may be recognized by the universal praise of modesty, that is, of a virtue invented on behalf of dull and commonplace people. Nevertheless, it is a virtue which, by exhibiting the necessity for dealing considerately with the wretched plight of these people, is just what calls attention to it. For our self-consciousness and our pride, there can be nothing more flattering than the sight of envy lurking in its retreat and plotting its schemes. But never let a man forget that where there is envy there is hatred, and let him be careful not to make a false friend out of any envious person. Therefore it is important to our safety to lay envy bare, and a man should study to discover its tricks, as it is everywhere to be found and always goes about incognito. Or, as I have said, like a venomous toad it lurks in dark corners. It deserves neither quarter nor sympathy, but as we can never reconcile it, let our rule of conduct be to scorn it with a good heart, and as our happiness and glory is torture to it, we may rejoice in its sufferings. We have been taking a look at the depravity of man, and it is a sight which may well fill us with horror. But now we must cast our eyes on the misery of his existence. And when we have done so, and are horrified by that too, we must look back again at his depravity. We shall then find that they hold the balance to each other. We shall perceive the eternal justice of all things, for we shall recognize that the world is itself the last judgment on it. And we shall begin to understand why it is that everything that lives must pay the penalty of its existence, first in living and then in dying. Thus the evil of the penalty accords with the evil of the sin, malum pone with malum culpe. From the same point of view we lose our indignation at that intellectual incapacity of the great majority of mankind, which in life so often disgusts us. In this samsara, as the Buddhists call it, human misery, human depravity, and human folly correspond with one another perfectly, and they are of like magnitude. But if, on some special inducement, we direct our gaze to one of them, and survey it in particular, it seems to exceed the other two. This, however, is an illusion, and merely the effect of their colossal range. All things proclaim this samsara, more than all else, the world of mankind, in which, from a moral point of view, villainy and baseness, and from an intellectual point of view, incapacity and stupidity, prevail to a horrifying extent. Nevertheless, there appear in it, although very spasmodically, and always as a fresh surprise, manifestations of honesty, of goodness, nay, even of nobility, and also of great intelligence, of the thinking mind of genius. They never quite vanish, but like single points of light gleam upon us out of the great dark mass. We must accept them as a pledge that this samsara contains a good and redeeming principle, which is capable of breaking through and of filling and freeing the whole of it. The readers of my ethics know that with me the ultimate foundation of morality is the truth which in the Vedas and in the Vedanta receives its expression in the established mystical formula, "This is thyself," which is spoken with reference to every living thing, be it man or beast, and is called the Mahavakya, the great word. Actions which proceed in accordance with this principle, such as those of the philanthropist, may indeed be regarded as the beginning of mysticism. Every benefit rendered with a pure intention proclaims that the man who exercises it acts in direct conflict with the world of appearance, for he recognizes himself as identical with another individual who exists in complete separation from him. Accordingly, all disinterested kindness is inexplicable. It is a mystery, and hence, in order to explain it, a man has to resort to all sorts of fictions. When Kant had demolished all other arguments for theism, he admitted one only, that it gave the best interpretation and solution of such mysterious actions, and of all others like them. He therefore allowed it to stand as a presumption unsusceptible indeed of theoretical proof, but valid from a practical point of view. I may, however, express my doubts whether he was quite serious about it, for to make morality rest on theism is really to reduce morality to egoism, although the English, it is true, as also the lowest classes of society with us, do not perceive the possibility of any other foundation for it. The above-mentioned recognition of man's own true being in another individual, objectively presented to him, is exhibited in a particularly beautiful and clear way, in the cases in which a man, already destined to death beyond any hope of rescue, gives himself up to the welfare of others with great solicitude and zeal, and tries to save them. Of this kind is the well-known story of a servant who was bitten in a courtyard at night by a mad dog. In the belief that she was beyond hope, she seized the dog and dragged it into a stable, which she then locked so that no one else might be bitten. Then again, there is the incident in Naples, which Tischbein has immortalized in one of his aquarelles. A son, fleeing from the lava which is rapidly streaming towards the sea, is carrying his aged father on his back. When there is only a narrow strip of land left between the devouring elements, the father bids the son put him down, so that the son may save himself by flight, as otherwise both will be lost. The son obeys, and as he goes casts a glance of farewell on his father. This is the moment depicted. The historical circumstance which Scott represents in his masterly way in The Heart of Midlothian, Chapter 2, is of a precisely similar kind, where, of two delinquents condemned to death, the one who, by his awkwardness, caused the capture of the other, happily sets him free in the chapel by overpowering the guard after the execution sermon, without at the same time making any attempt on his own behalf. Nay, in the same category must also be placed the scene which is represented in a common engraving, which may perhaps be objectionable to Western readers. I mean the one in which a soldier, kneeling to be shot, is trying, by waving a cloth, to frighten away his dog, who wants to come to him. In all of these cases, we see an individual in the face of his own immediate and certain destruction, no longer thinking of saving himself, so that he may direct the whole of his efforts to saving someone else. How could there be a clearer expression of the consciousness that what is being destroyed is only a phenomenon, and that the destruction itself is only a phenomenon? That, on the other hand, the real being of the man who meets his death is untouched by that event and lives on in the other man, in whom even now, as his action betrays, he so clearly perceives it to exist. For if this were not so, and it was his real being which was about to be annihilated, how could that being spend its last efforts in showing such an ardent sympathy in the welfare and continued existence of another? There are two different ways in which a man may become conscious of his own existence. On the one hand, he may have an empirical perception of it, as it manifests itself externally, something so small that it approaches a vanishing point, set in a world which, as regards time and space, is infinite, one only of the 1,000 millions of human creatures who run about on this planet for a very brief period and are renewed every 30 years. On the other hand, by going down into the depths of his own nature, a man may become conscious that he is all in all, that, in fact, he is the only real being, and that, in addition, this real being perceives itself again in others, who present themselves from without as though they formed a mirror of himself. Of these two ways in which a man may come to know what he is, the first grasps the phenomenon alone, the mere product of the principle of individuation, whereas the second makes a man immediately conscious that he is the thing in itself. This is a doctrine in which, as regards the first way, I have Kant, and as regards both, I have the Vedas to support me. There is, it is true, a simple objection to the second method. It may be said to assume that one and the same being can exist in different places at the same time, and yet be complete in each of them. Although, from an empirical point of view, this is the most palpable impossibility, nay, absurdity, it is nevertheless perfectly true of the thing in itself. The impossibility and the absurdity of it, empirically, are only due to the forms which phenomena assume, in accordance with the principle of individuation. For the thing in itself, the will to live, exists whole and undivided in every being, even in the smallest, as completely as in the sum total of all things that ever were or are or will be. This is why every being, even the smallest, says to itself, "So long as I am safe, let the world perish. Dum ego salva sim periat mundus." And, in truth, even if only one individual were left in the world, and all the rest were to perish, the one that remained would still possess the whole self-being of the world, uninjured and undiminished, and would laugh at the destruction of the world as an illusion. This conclusion, per impossibile, may be balanced by the counter-conclusion, which is on all fours with it, that if that last individual were to be annihilated in and with him, the whole world would be destroyed. It was in this sense that the mystic, Angelus Silesius, declared that God could not live for a moment without him, and that if he were to be annihilated, God must of necessity give up the ghost. But the empirical point of view also, to some extent, enables us to perceive that it is true, or at least possible, that our self can exist in other beings whose consciousness is separated and different from our own. That this is so is shown by the experience of somnambulists. Although the identity of their ego is preserved throughout, they know nothing, when they awake, of all that a moment before they themselves said, did, or suffered. So entirely is the individual consciousness a phenomenon that even in the same ego, two consciousnesses can arise of which the one knows nothing of the other.